going to be looking at Israel, and we're going to be looking at something called Zionism. Our objectives as we look at this are going to be our familiar set. One, we need to know the basic information and the background setting for the conflict. We need to know who are the main groups in each conflict. And more importantly, we need to understand what motivated those groups to participate in the fighting. And remember, it's always a mix of motivations. We've got the public motives, the things we tell people about, the private motives that we keep to ourselves, aren't necessarily bad, but not the ones we want to advertise as the reasons for what we do, and then the ulterior motives. Those things that we actively try to keep secret because they may be motives that are selfish and bad. And I want you to be able then to evaluate, to judge the actions and the motivations of the different groups, to decide what you think is the relative importance of those different motivations. And as with our previous conflicts, I want you to be able to form your own opinion about whether so-called religious conflicts are really religious conflicts or conflicts about something else. Now, on to Zionism. What is it? At this point, I don't expect that we know a lot, but I'm going to give you 15 seconds of this 30-second clock to choose the option you think best describes Zionism. There we go. And a solid majority of you identified it as a Jewish nationalist movement, and that's what Zionism is. And we're going to find out that Zionism is a major part of the story of religious conflict, especially in the 20th century and continuing on into the 21st century. Matter of fact, right now, some of the disagreements between more strongly Zionist groups and less strongly Zionist groups, one way to think about them, is suggesting some people to think that Israel might be on the verge of a civil war. Right, so a war fought between Israelis rather than between Israelis and their Arab neighbors, which is what most of the wars involving Israel have been about. Okay, so what is Zionism? It's a little more than just the answer from the previous screen, and we need a pretty specific definition. This one comes from the Anti-Defamation League. It is a Jewish organization, and what it tells us is that Zionism is the movement for self-determination. And remember, we know what self-determination is. That's the idea that nations should be able to form their own sovereign and independent countries. And statehood. And we know that states are those independent countries that have sovereignty. Their governments are the highest authority in those countries. So that's what Zionism wants, and where it wants it is what Jews see as their ancestral homeland in Israel. Now, breaking that down, I'm not sure you guys will find that an entirely more simple definition, but it puts it more in terms of the language we have used in this class, especially in talking about Ireland. The Jewish nation, the group of people who share a culture and a territory, should have their own independent sovereign state or sovereign country in the Holy Land. And if you're thinking Holy Land, is that thing that the Crusaders went to fight over? Yes, same Holy Land. That same Holy Land where the Crusaders went and killed a lot of Jews in Jerusalem. So why is Zionism an important idea for Jews? Well, publicly, what Zionists argue is that the Jews should have their own independent and sovereign state in the Holy Land because that chunk of territory has been the homeland of what the Bible referred to as Israelites and what have later become known as Jews have inhabited for thousands of years. And Zionists tell us, as their public religious motive, that this land was a gift to them from God as their promised land. It's where they ended up after Moses led them out of Israel, or not Israel, led them out of slavery in Egypt through things like the crossing of the Red Sea by Moses parting the waters, but then the Jews having to wander, or the Israelites as they were known at the time, having to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. But after all of that, they ended up in the Promised Land. For this, understand, this is what Zionists tell us. This does not require that you take some of these events described in the Old Testament as fact, but understand that this is what the Zionists believe, and what they publicly explain to other people are the reasons they do what they do. Continuing with why Zionism, there's also a public political motive. There's the public religious motive that we just covered, but then there's also the political motive. The Jews are a nation. Whether or not you want to take the Old Testament as truth or not, the Jews are a nation. They have a Jewish culture, which is based on a shared history. A shared history of being scattered to other parts of the world, being persecuted in other parts of the world, Russia, Central Europe, Western Europe, Northern Europe, and England. For example, shared history of the Holocaust, but also, of course, their shared religion as Jews. They also share a language, and language is a key part of culture. The language for the Jewish nation is Hebrew. A lot of Jews speak Yiddish. It's a language that is very close in a lot of ways to German, but the language of the Jewish nation is Hebrew. And this is key because the Jewish nation went to a lot of work to make Hebrew their language. It was a dead language, like Latin is today. There are no native speakers of Latin today. There are people who can learn Latin, but there's nobody who grows up with their parents speaking Latin at home, right, and learning it from childhood. The same was once true of Hebrew. There were no native speakers. It was a written language. There were people who learned it. But again, it was like the Latin that had been spoken by the Romans. the Jews picked it up in the 1800s and brought it back to life. And now it is a language that is spoken as native language by 9 million people. Well, by native, as a native language or as a second language by 9 million people. Remember, a nation not only needs to have a shared culture, but also a territory. And for them, that territory is the Holy Land. If you think, well, okay, but that was just something you were talking about in the religious motives, you're right. Yeah, the motivations of Zionists do not rely on your belief or disbelief in the Old Testament of the Bible. Right? Historically, we do know that the Israelites, that we refer today as Israelis or Jews, had lived in what is now the Holy Land, right? Or what we now consider the Holy Land. We also know that they had been driven out of it. Right? That's just in the historical record. It's not just religious stuff, right? It's written down in lots of different places, and we've been able to track the movement of the Jews out of that area since, as they were scattered. So they have a historical claim to that chunk of territory as much as a religious one. And then, of course, we add to that self-determination, which was one of those big ideas coming out of World War I. It was the same big idea that the Irish nationalists latched onto. Nations should have their own states. The Irish people were a nation. They should have their own sovereign, independent state. Jews said the same thing, right? Zionists said the same thing. Now go to a motive that for some might be considered public, but for others a private motivation of Zionism. Again, it really just kind of would depend on which Zionists you were referring to. But this motivation was about having a safe place for Jews with their own country. In the various parts of the world Jews had lived, they had long histories of being persecuted and being the victims of atrocities. They had often been killed by European Christians. We saw that in the Crusades. The Peasants' Crusade killed Jews as they moved through Europe towards the Holy Land. The soldiers who fought in the First Crusade massacred Jews alongside Muslims when they captured Israel. So that leads us with the story of the Peasant Crusaders, but also during the Black Death, which I realize is something we've not talked about very much, and we have certainly not talked about it in a while. If we have time, we will get back to it. But the Black Death was a devastating pandemic. It was actually a series of different pandemics over centuries. Kind of during the middle set of the Black Death pandemic, the Jews were often killed because the Christians blamed them for spreading the Black Death. It really wasn't that the Jews were spreading the Black Death. It happened to be that the Jews living among Christians didn't seem to be dying from the Black Death as much as the Christians around them. This wasn't because of some kind of Jewish magic. This was because Jews followed those Old Testament teachings about cleanliness. And so the Jews did a lot of things that kept the Black Death from wiping out their communities. And so as the Christians who are suffering from the Black Death look at the Jews around them, they're like, they're not getting sick like we are. This must be some kind of curse that they are putting on us. What's that? Sanitization. Yes, that was really what the Jews were doing by following their Old Testament standards of cleanliness. They were also, over time, persecuted by European governments. In Russia, these official persecutions were known as the pogroms. It looks like that video has gone. Let me try and find that again. These were attacks on Jewish people that were either directly organized by the Russian government or at least kind of encouraged. Like, it'd be nice if some of you non-Jews in Russia would go attack Jewish villages. While you guys are finishing writing that, let's see if I can't find that video. Well, it looks like that video just no longer exists, which is kind of unfortunate because it was kind of a good demonstration of how these pogroms worked. But nevertheless, we'll move on and we'll look at the more familiar persecution under Nazi Germany. When we think about what the Nazis did to the Jews in Europe, mostly think about the Holocaust itself and the killing of the Jews. But it started with persecution through things such as Kristallnacht, which was when Jewish stores and businesses were smashed up, right? Kristallnacht means the night of the broken glass. Jews were also forced to identify by wearing armbands or sewed on stars to their clothes that indicated that they were Judah or Jews. And then, of course, as I said, what we're more familiar with, what some of you might be learning about in English classes right now, is the Holocaust. Or yes, some of you may have learned about it last year. It seems the Holocaust is kind of taught and retaught throughout the public school system. For those of you, though, that are